I forgot to
Yeah,
press record.
that's okay. And so for me, these joint ventures are kind of probably created the foundation for the trouble now, because obviously all this learning and has gone from the US and Europe's history and even Japan, but you don't really hear about Japanese manufacturers creating joint ventures in China. And all this knowledge is now in China. People are moving incredibly quickly. They're pushing boundaries. Cars are being churned out in 2 years instead of I think Mazda always held the record, for like 33 months was the quickest turnaround from literally project kickoff to cars rolling off the line. 33 months was like held up as the standard bearer. Now Chinese companies are doing like 26, 27. It's crazy. And so, for me, this latest EU investigation is, it's kind of a bit antiquated and I think a bit naive. Like, actually, shouldn't you just be encouraging your own European automakers to kind of move quicker? Because, yeah, I said earlier, for me, BMW especially, and actually Mercedes, they've been very conservative in their design, and Volkswagen actually, all the German companies especially, very conservative in their design, and the Chinese companies have really forced them to look at things and go, oh shit, we're moving way too slow. And that's why I was talking about Lotus last week, because for me, I look at Geely's influence on, they're not influencing vehicle design, but I look at the companies they're involved with. I look at Volvo's transition, and now I look at some of the attractive vehicles that Lotus are producing. We just had the new, I don't know if you saw the, share my screen? Entire screen? Share it. I don't know if people have seen the, the Lotus Emea, like a Grand GT. It's not working, is it?
I need to unlock your browser's screen sharing permission, but that's okay because we can edit this part out with their cool new editing tools. So there is no problem as long as I can figure it out. Open your computer system settings, click privacy and security. Okay, click screen recording. Okay, and allow your browser to share the screen. Well, it says it is. Oh, maybe you have to do that on your side. Open up your system settings.
Oh yeah. What should I do? Browser needs screen share permission. What should I do?
Privacy and security.
Okay, privacy and security. Yep. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Screen recording.
Where is that? What's the bottom?
Yep, red. Below input monitoring, above automation.
Yep, got it. Google Chrome. Nice, done. Quit and reopen. All right.
Send me the link.
I guess I'm not
drop me the link in WhatsApp. I'll share.
Yeah, nice. But I mean, so to me, again, this is a cool car. We were speaking about Lotus last week, and what I wanted to do a bit more, as I said to you, I wanted to do a bit more research into Lotus Emea. I wanted to do a bit more research myself into Lotus, as I've said to you before, because I hold them up as a standard bearer. Yes, they haven't produced many vehicles. I wouldn't say they're a commercial success, but I'd say, there's a reason Tesla chose the Elise as its backbone, as its chassis and body structure, base body structure, because they're so well packaged. And I've got some quotes from Colin Chapman. So Colin Chapman was the person who founded Lotus in 1948. And, just typical at that time, loads of these little custom coach builders, I guess, who were building these really light, dynamic vehicles. But Colin Chapman was even amongst those kind of people. He was a bit of a maverick. And so he really, really pushed, being lightweight to the point where there's some great quotes I found. Where are they? I love these quotes. When asked why he didn't put a roll cage in his cars, his response was, if you're going to crash, you're going to crash. A roll cage won't help. When asked about putting bigger engines, going for more power, he was like, I'd rather have a lighter car that goes slower than a heavier car that goes faster. And one of his, I need to find one of his famous quotes, but it was, here we go. So his whole design ethos, and I think the reason, this is why I hold them above most other manufacturers, at least in terms of the quality of the engineering: simplify, then add lightness. It might be his most, yeah. And so, to me, like that's the ethos that has flown through all of Lotus cars historically. Again, the Elise always held up as a standard bearer. And so I'm now looking at some of the vehicles that they're bringing out, knowing the kind of engineering mindset in Lotus, knowing the consultancy work that they still do for other companies, especially around packaging. These are going to be sturdy cars. They're going to be reliable. They're going to be dynamic. I'm expecting, yes, they're premium vehicles, but I'm expecting their range to be pretty impressive. Their footprints. I don't know if I mentioned the footprint for the EMEA. I need to dig into footprints more. But these aren't huge cars. They look like they might be, but they're not. They're actually very well packaged vehicles. And Lotus, again, have always been famous for finding ways to create interior space by doing funky things with gearbox positions, and things like that. So I'm actually really excited for them.
Wow.
They entered. So he founded Lotus in 1948. Colin Chapman, again, just as an engineer. I don't know who he was working for. I think he was just working like out of his garage for a while. Big into motorcycles, and then obviously got into racing. So he founded Lotus, and then in 52 enters Formula One. And then they created what's called the Lotus 7. I don't know if you're familiar with the Lotus 7. I'll again have to send you a link in the chat to what the Lotus 7. But the Lotus 7 not only was a pioneering race car, but also in terms of its design, it was kind of it's crazy simple. It's actually still used as foundations, I think, for certain cars now. Even now, like Morgan. So if you know Morgan and companies like that, a lot of them still use Lotus 7 components, which is absolutely crazy. Let me send you that. Yeah, there you go. I mean, it's like I say, if you look at a lot of like Ariel Atoms and a lot of kit cars now, these are all based on the Lotus 7. Like this obviously started off as a race car, but became a road legal vehicle. Like no one had ever done that before. And arguably, like no one's done it any better since, really, because it's, we're starting to evolve away from, manual steering. It's all e-pass, it's everything. So, you're lacking some of that physical connection. You are literally sat in between the wheels. The wheels are inches either side of you all the way around. So, center of gravity is right where you are in the vehicle. So when you want to throw it into a corner, you know exactly how much effort to put in. So I always hold Lotus up for these reasons. And I think it's still been, yes, it finished production in 1973. Only ever had, I think, 4-cylinder engines because obviously of its speed. But it's a car that I think people should know more of. I'm guessing, had you heard of the Lotus 7 before I brought it up?
Only in passing. I knew what it looked like, but I couldn't be like, if I saw one, I wouldn't be like, oh yeah, that's perfectly the Lotus 7. But like I've seen that car before.
Well, and also you'll recognize it as Caterham. Caterham, I think might even own the rights to the 7. I'm not sure, or they pay Lotus to use the rights to not the name, but to the designs and the package, I think.
So, like, what is your perspective when thinking about how Lotus as a company is kind of its origins, where it grew into? From my perspective, a real surge in popularity and uniqueness in the early or late 1990s through the early to mid 2010s with models like the Elise, the Exige, and the variants of them, and how they've been used by other kind of one-off manufacturers to improve upon or go crazy with their own ideas. And now really having somewhat of a quiet decade with some good models, but definitely not in the spotlight from my perspective as maybe they once were 15, 20 years ago. And now coming in with a whole new approach and a vision towards the future with new ownership, new management, kind of new direction, still using some of the same ethos. The Miura that you just showed me, and then now I've been looking at some of their other models that are intending to come out in the near future, and you have like a Jaguar I-Pace or Macan EV competitor with a small crossover EV sports vehicle, and also very impressive figures. When you look at the Lotus commercial boss, Mike Johnston, said what the company expects to take the Type 134 to account for half of its annual sales by 2028. 75,000 units a
Wow.
year. I mean, that's a big deal for this
It
company.
is. It is. And I mean, but to me, I'm just looking now, there's around just under 1,400 people who work for Lotus. I want to
Wow.
check the Aston Martin. Yeah, I want to check. They're not a big company. Right. So Aston Martin has twice as many staff as Lotus.
Wow. And yet they're going to be positioning themselves as like a premier EV sports vehicle option, which is one, very forward thinking and kind of alludes to what you were bringing up at the beginning of this call. But two, I mean, do you see Lotus as kind of contending for perhaps in the next 5 to 10 years as a premier English vehicle brand because of the backing of Geely, because of the direction they're taking, because of how they're positioning themselves in the market?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I think you asked quite a few questions. I'll answer that one, then we'll go back to what you were talking about in terms of their heritage and their successes and failures and how they've come to be what they've come to be. But if you, I mean, Jaguar aren't producing a vehicle until 26, 20. It's either I've got 25 and 27 in my head. I think it's later than 2025, to be honest. But anyway, if we said Jaguar, because they've stopped designing or they've stopped producing new products. They've gone back to the drawing board, and their first vehicle will be out in 2025, I believe. They're going to be an EV only brand, right? And they're premium, Jaguar premium. They're not going to go to Bentley levels. I wouldn't expect. I don't know if that makes sense, but who knows, right? But if you look at British premium vehicles, I mean, you go from things like Morgan, real down to earth, dynamic car. You've got, I guess, MG technically, but they're Chinese owned and they're obviously not really premium. They're kind of low cost EVs. You've got obviously Land Rover, very much on the SUV side of things, and premium, but like not. I mean, the vehicles range from what $45,000 up to I guess 200,000, right? So it's quite a broad range. You've got Aston Martin, very premium, GTs, sports cars. Now the SUV, but I'd be surprised if they ever go into like a Porsche Macan territory. So there isn't obviously many British car brands either anymore. But even obviously Rolls-Royce being the utmost premium, Lotus seem to be positioning themselves around like the Porsche Cayenne, Porsche Taycan price ranges. Creating dynamic products that are, they're not going to cost $50,000. These are definitely going to be significantly more. But obviously they've been able to completely rethink the engineering. They're not using legacy platforms. They're also not using, I mean, I'm sure they'll be using some aspect of Geely's engineering, whether it be in chassis form or in terms of experience. But, a lot of their experience is their own. And I would expect them to be, producing vehicles around the $80,000, $100,000, $120,000 upwards $1,000. But, so maybe this EMEA is actually headed right for the Porsche Taycan. Now that's quite brave.
No, I mean it's not, because if you looked at the article you sent me, the figures are the competitor to the Taycan Turbo S in terms of
Yep.
performance, capacity. Like, I think very much so. Honestly, I want to show you something that I've just pulled up here, which actually prices out every Lotus model over the past handful of years. So I'll start at the
Yep.
bottom because it's the discontinued models. So when you look at the Elise, the Evora,
Yep.
the Exige, I mean, 50,000,
Yep.
99,000, although this is very recent, and then
Yep.
66,000.
Yep.
Obviously, inflation to be considered. But now looking at these new
Mm-hmm.
models, you have an SUV at 115, you have
Yeah.
their hypercar above 2 million, their Type 135, estimated 80. I don't know if that's going to be true or not. the Emir at 77 and the Maya at 100,000. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely moving up, but it is positioning itself as slightly more affordable than other premium. Like the Taken is tremendously more expensive. I would imagine the
Yeah.
Macan EV. I'm curious where that comes in at. I'm imagining somewhere in like the Rivian SUV price, like maybe like 80, 90.
Could be.
But it's hard to say because I mean, when I look at that model specifically, you have a base Macan that starts at 58. So then the EV is going to
Okay.
be towards the Macan Turbo. So I'm wondering if the Macan EV is
It's
going to
probably
come out
more.
with already like a turbo badge or a different name entirely, just so that people don't feel
Yeah.
like it doesn't equate in their mind when comparing other Macans. And
And they
maybe
could
they don't
justify the
even
price
call it a
increase.
Macan. Totally. But when I think about Lotus, like it is interesting how they're going to be sitting probably more expensive. I mean, definitely more expensive than Jaguar of old, depending how Jaguar shifts their brand
Yeah.
focus. They're
Exactly.
definitely going to be like in the price range of the upper half of Land Rovers, although they're competing really only on their small SUV front, which is one of many models that Land Rover offers. When I think about like even Mini Cooper, they're not really in this field at all. So, the, but when I look at
Let me ask you a
EVs as a
question, Greg.
whole, they're definitely yeah. Please,
When you personally, when someone says to you Lotus cars, what do you think? I want to understand their brand reputation from your perspective.
sure. I fell in love with the Elise and Exige. I mean, that's when I was kind of coming
Mm-hmm.
up to snuff with the car world. And like I looked at those cars as so fun, this crazy kind of supercharged engine. If you got into the later Exige model, I thought they looked great. I mean, I never saw one in
Mm-hmm.
person, so I'm always of the perspective that if I did, it would be like, wow, that's actually so much smaller than I thought. Maybe this isn't the right car for
The
me.
Elise is
I'd love to sit
tiny.
in one,
The Elise is
but
tiny.
racing that car on Gran Turismo, it was always a blast, and that was my perception of the brand. I knew that they had bigger models before, and they had models that didn't really like appeal to me as much just from like the look, but they were older. And for me, it
Yep.
was the iconic ones was that Elise Exige body shape that kind of looked like an aquatic kind of like hips and really like flowy. And then some of them had the aggressive wheel arches and vents. And then you look at companies like Hennessy that it lengthened the wheelbase and put a monster engine in there and would go for the top speed record. So that was always my notion of the brand. And then when they came out with the Evora, it was kind of like, oh, that's an evolution that I don't necessarily love, but it's cool and kind of makes sense. And now the brand seems to be taking a really different direction. Um, yeah,
Yep.
that's kind of my
Which I
take on
think
Lotus.
is okay. I mean, so it's interesting because I think in the UK and in Europe especially, people a lot of people still remember, late 60s, early 70s when Lotus actually dominated Formula One. Like it was
Right.
winning. It won Indianapolis 500. I think they won. I think Jim Clark in '68. Let me get this right. And Jim Clark in '68 won the. Um, he won Indianapolis 500. He won the. Where is it? He won the Formula One, and he won another specific race as well. It was the first to ever win, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. So it was
Wow.
the first Triple Crown. Graham Hill, sorry, not Jim Clark. Graham Hill, all in Lotuses, but all in. I mean, can you imagine trying to win the Formula One and 24 Hours of Le Mans and Indianapolis 500 all in a year in the same car?
Couldn't be done today. Unfathomable record that would never be
No.
achieved again.
I think Lotus was some of the first vehicles to use aluminium and fiberglass. Actually, especially, we really pushed for. They might have even been one of the first to use monocoque designs as well. In obviously the Citroen DS was the very first in like 1939, which is insane. But yeah, they really pushed like a monocoque design in road vehicles, and I think also aerodynamics was used, so they were the first to start putting all these extra little tweaks and little underbodies and diffusers and aerofoils onto their cars. So you know, massive racing heritage, and at least remembered in Europe and the UK. That's why I asked you, because I was interested to understand your heritage. Because then, as is often the case, I remember when I was at McLaren, people were saying, and people have said, and it still seems to prove true, when McLaren were ramping up, or when McLaren were producing loads of road cars, their Formula One performance dipped. When they're not really
Mm.
producing road cars, their Formula One performance is always very high. And it seems to be the case with Lotus. When Lotus were racing, especially as in the mid 70s, when they started to produce the Elan, for example, their Formula One performance dropped off quite a bit. And then obviously into the 80s, when they were still actually doing pretty well, when their Formula One performance tailed off, they were starting to produce loads of cars.
Right.
And then obviously, then they were taken over by Proton, I think, in 2000. And that was just, the year 2000 and around early 2000s was when the British car industry had basically collapsed and companies were being sold off for pittance. But obviously, Proton weren't exactly a very stable and robust company at that time either, so they didn't know how to handle them. And so obviously that really hurt their reputation. They were producing much. Then there was obviously the overpromise in the very early 2010s, late 2000s. This whole plan to produce vast amounts of vehicles and this whole model line that was never funded. They never had any funding for it. Now they do. And I think the reason I'm really interested in them is because they're always going to be a niche brand. I don't see how they can suddenly start producing 1 million vehicles. And just as you were saying, that's probably not their plan. But there's enough people who, probably looking for something a little bit cheaper than a Taycan, who are looking for something, like a Porsche Cayenne, but that isn't necessarily as bulky. It looks a bit more sleek and dynamic. And, they look at like an Audi SQ8 and go, the thing's a boat. They're like, really? Is this all there is at this price range? Yes, it's might be powerful and kind of quick, but like, it's not dynamic. And I've got a family of 4, but I still want something, I want to be able to carry them around, and I personally want to enjoy driving it. So I think Lotus will always remain for drivers, and so that's why I think, that's where they're positioning themselves. I assume using the heritage. I've not seen any advertisements, but I would expect them to use some of that heritage in it.
Sure.
And I think the biggest question then just becomes around price ranges and quality. If they can deliver a good level of reliability, I think it's a really interesting brand reputation. And maybe some of these cars will be people's second cars. Maybe they won't even be their first car. Maybe they've got the Porsche Cayenne, but they have an Emea or something as a second car, right? The GT for the weekends or the long road trips. I don't know. But yeah, I think it's an interesting story. And again, a good, a feather in the cap of Geely for, knowing how to manage multiple brands and, provide distinction. Because I think some of the Chinese companies are being criticized for having this, like, this blanket approach to car development. Everything looks kind of the same and they're not very imaginative. Geely produce their own cars in China, but you don't hear about the Geely brand in outside China, but their influence in the automotive industry is massive.
Especially
so I'll be
now.
intrigued to see what happens with this. Yeah, exactly. So I'll be really intrigued to see what happens with Lotus, and I'm really intrigued to see what happens with this EU investigation. But like I said, to meet standard practice, you've got the IRA pumping over $1 trillion into the US economy, specifically basically giving incentives to its own companies. So why is what China's doing any different? In reality, it's probably a highlight that the US and Europe and stuff, and even actually almost definitely the Japanese companies have moved so slowly. They've been so slow to adapt to the rate of change that's happening in China, that China is then introducing to people, just like Tesla have done. Chinese companies have found what people want, and they're going to give it them. And they're going to be cheap EVs. They're going to have loads of touch screens. They're going to be bright, airy, kind of good looking, and probably reliable. And that's, fortunately, that's what most people want. So yeah, interesting.
It's
Time.
interesting that you bring up kind of like, you mentioned it, but it's like the two things that Lotus potentially has had issues with, either simultaneously or at each one respectively at different times, but quality and reliability. And it sounds like those two problems have really the opportunity to be solved with Geely backing this and having a really professional manufacturing first approach with actual experience producing cars, not in small batches, but with the Chinese mindset. And so it's like, man, if you just knock those two possibilities out the window and saying like every car is going to be reliable, it is an EV platform, it's been proven, we know how to do it, and we can manufacture these at scale at a high level of quality, it's like, well, now is Lotus like the British version of Porsche? A designer or I mean, driver-oriented car that has history in racing and built for those who enjoy driving experience. And then we kind of tailor everything based on the model, based on the customer, based on the price point, which kind of seems like if you rewind to Porsche of the mid 2000s when they started coming out with SUVs and different models. And it's like, yeah, well, they kind of had a rough patch in terms of funding. Quality wasn't always there. And then
Mm-hmm.
they kind of understand how to build cars for the consumer, took a different approach, and then have kind of been on the up and up for a while. And when you think about it, they're still very driver oriented. They still fall back on their history, and not in every
Yeah.
way, but in some parallels, potentially Lotus has the same possibility to do for the British car ecosystem.
The Porsche Cayenne saved Porsche. And actually, in the same way, people will probably look at the DBX for Aston Martin and say it probably saved Aston Martin. Now they're reporting record volumes. The average price per
Right.
car is at the highest it's ever been for Aston because of all the customizations. People would have gone. I've not even looked at the stats for the Ferrari SUV, but I'm sure people would have said the same. Like, oh my god, what a Ferrari doing with an SUV? But you have to evolve, like as Einstein said. Sorry, not Einstein, as Darwin said. You evolve and you adapt or you die. And
Yep.
it's
So
the way the world
perhaps
works, which again kind of comes full circle to what we said last week.
it's the EV that saves Lotus, right? Like, who knows? I guess we'll see. We could talk about it in a few years.
Quite possibly.
What I'd like to what I'd like to touch on that you brought up a handful of minutes ago was you're talking about Jaguar and how they're kind of reformatting their position as a company and understanding how to approach the future in an electrified vehicle world. Can you touch on like your insights on that and specifically like relate back to your experience working at Jaguar Land Rover and how that company
Mm-hmm.
culture could either support or negatively impact this direction? I'd love your thoughts.
It's a good question. I mean, I touched on it, but never went into details around, the amount of people at Lotus versus Aston Martin, for example. And what I was then going to say was, it compares to over 40,000 people at Jaguar Land Rover. And so, you know, there are companies like your GMs and Fords where, with huge amounts of history and huge amounts of people, but also huge amounts of bureaucracy, it can be difficult to pivot. And I think during my time at Jaguar, you could feel a lot of pain where they were dealing with a lot of legacy processes and a lot of legacy staff, let's be honest, people who were getting on their way to retirement age, so weren't going to leave, weren't really motivated to really branch out and try lots of new things and really challenge conception. And so it was a constant kind of back and forth, push and pull, trying to battle through some of that. At the same time, there were some people in leadership positions who were very, very forthright and weren't necessarily willing to accommodate changes or willing to accommodate discussion. So especially so for both Jaguar and Land Rover, I don't know how many people know this, but most car companies are what they call engineering led. So what you'll do is you'll give the engineers a load of time, and they will work on developing maybe a platform, and they'll do it in isolation to really make things. They've got a load of boxes and things you have to tick around safety and regulation and emissions. So they're trying to get it nice and light, but they've got all these different vehicles that are going to be on it. So they design the platform, and it will come with its limitations, often physical limitations. If you look at the MEB and MQB platforms, and you'll start to look at if you look at the Skoda Kodiaq and the Audi Q5, and the Volkswagen Tiguan and these kind of vehicles, you'll notice a lot of very similar proportions, even down to, I think we met touched on this before, even down to the angles of like rear windshields and kind of shapes around the rear fenders, for example, because a lot of the body structure and all the crash structure and load paths are the same across the platform. You can't really vary that. So it limits proportions. So for a lot of companies, they start with the engineering and then they beautify it. So they'll get designers to try and build proportions around it. Yeah, nice. Thank you.
For reference to our US
So
audience who doesn't see these
yeah,
cars.
sorry, good point. Sorry, good point. And so whereas Jaguar and Land Rover have focused really on being design led. So what they'll do is there are the engineers kind of set some limitations, but the design team, right from the beginning, are working on clay models. They're designing things. They're asking if overhangs can be changed. Why can't the body structure be changed in this way? So they really push convention. Now, what it actually does is arguably create some inefficiency. It can add weight, for example. Land Rover and Jaguar products are historically very uncompetitive from a weight perspective. But what it does do is definitely removes the Russian doll syndrome, which is where all cars look almost the same. They're just wheelbases change and the small evolutions. Like, if you go from a Land Rover Discovery to a Range Rover Sport to a Defender, all on the same platform, they are vastly different cars in terms of how they look. Even though under the hood, into the body structure, a lot of similarities. Probably less similarities than engineering-led companies, and so that was always a stress and a pain point. Where Jaguar is going, obviously, there's still people, legacy people, but there's also a lot of people who have gone through that, like my age, who came into the company 10, 12 years ago, and now in senior positions, and they're adaptable and they're willing to try new things. It's still going to create pain. So from a working culture perspective, I think they're probably in a better place now than they were. There's obviously going to be disillusion, I imagine, because they want to also, just like Volkswagen have said, they want to move away from the old school engineering mindset about developing products to, can we be agile? Can we develop our products more like they do in software? Can we evolve? Can products last longer? But we just evolve with software updates on a more regular basis. There's all these things that are happening now, and not just in Jaguar, but across the car industry, trying to change the way things work because the product itself is evolving so dramatically. That's going to be tough. And Britain doesn't have that imperiousness it used to have. So there isn't this huge amount of wealth. There aren't all these government incentives available. There will be some, but the British government isn't going to put together a $1.3 trillion IRA package to boost Britain's industry. There just isn't that money available. So there'll be some incentives for Jaguar, but nowhere near what others can do. What I will say is there's a reason people like Rimac are building a big base in central England. There's a reason Polestar are in the centre of England. There's a reason you've still got Aston Martin, you've got Land Rover, and obviously Jaguar, and all these other companies, because there's a real history and culture of engineering. Williams engineering, incredible consultants around the world. So I'm expecting, what I am hearing is that some of the designs that are being proposed are really wacky and pretty out there, and definitely a step away from legacy culture of trying to create. So I think if you look at even the XF of 2010, I think it was, the XJ of 2007, the F-Pace of F-Types of 2014, and the SUVs that followed, there was some kind of lineage in terms of its design, trying to follow some principles of what's gone before. What I'm hearing is that this is going to be, it's like press restart with Jaguar. Like, wow. I'm sure they're going to want to use the legacy and heritage, especially the racing traditions, that the dynamism that comes from Jaguar. Grace, space, pace was the motto, and I'm sure will probably be influential going forwards. But in terms of what actually is going to be delivered as a product, it's going to be pretty different to anything that's come before. So then it's all about, do they have the brand strength to do that? Especially if your Jaguars just aren't mentioned for 3-4 years, right? No one's talking about Jaguar for the last 2 years, and they're not talking about it for the next 18 months, right? Until Jaguar start throwing out some teasers. That's hugely risky. You have to, and Jaguar's brand strength has been weakened over quite a few years, right? So that's going to be the challenge. Like, how do they position themselves? To me, it's kind of similar to Lotus, except Lotus have been producing cars even in very small volumes, and they've been pretty consistent. Jaguar tried to go high volume with the XE, and they've obviously branched out into sport brakes and SUVs and all of these different things. Lotus hasn't. So though their volumes have been very low, their brand reputation has been very consistent in terms of the products they produce. Jaguar's not there anymore. So I don't know all the products that are being developed, and I don't know what their strategy is, but it's going to be interesting to see whether their brand reputation holds up. And I think only time will tell. What are your thoughts on Jaguar? Like, again, as a brand, as a heritage, and also like, where do you think they could position these products, knowing the reputation to you?
I'm going to leave that one a mystery. And with time running out to the end here, I don't know, but I loved your perspective on it. I think I'm going to stew on it. I love how we talked about Lotus at the beginning and kind of like how they're evolving quicker and have kind of built a foundation. And now we talked about a company that you have a lot of personal history with, but also, comparing the similarities and differences from their business model, but also the cars themselves. So I think that's a good note to leave on. Another moment of British car history and potentially the future
Absolutely.
remains to be seen here.
I want to
All
say
right.
one thing though, and this is actually
Sure.
for our next session is I would love to talk about Neue Klasse, the latest BMW Neue Klasse, and kind of like where it's going to go, your thoughts on it, especially because I know you're a huge fan of BMW. And we can also go back to the previous Neue Klasse, which saved BMW. And I would argue that BMW needs saving right now because its products are pants. So I'll be intrigued I think I'd love to discuss that with you next time. I think that would be a really interesting topic.
Perfect. We know what we're going to talk about.